Hello and welcome to Paulian Provocation 1. Was Jesus trying to make Galilean villages great again? I hope our time together today can address that question, indirectly at least, because I'm curious to hear what you all think about it too. We'll start with the reading from Diarmaid and MacCulloch, the introduction to his book, where on page 2 he says quite clearly that Christianity is, at root, a personality cult. Hard to argue with that, given the importance of Jesus in the tradition throughout time. On page 4, MacCulloch also makes the point that throughout most of its history, Christianity has been the most intolerant of world faiths. This stems from the very beginning. Christians had an edge to them, we might say. We'll talk more about that coming up. It's also important to recognize that Christianity, as MacCulloch claims on page 8, was, in its first 5 centuries especially, really a dialogue between Judaism and Greco-Roman philosophy. And we'll be looking at some of the details of that moving forward. But there is an ideological component, a theological component from the very beginning of the movement, of course, that stems from Jesus' teaching, Jesus' life, but also took a variety of forms in relationship to movements within Judaism and movements within Greco-Roman philosophy and culture as well. One thing that's important for historians to recognize is the mutations that have taken place throughout the history of Christianity and the variety that was present in Christianity from the very beginning. We'll be taking a look throughout the semester at a number of non-canonical sources, that is, sources that were used by the first Christians, the early Christians, but that didn't make it into the canon for one reason or another. This helps us address the variety of Christianity that was the case from the very beginning and is certainly the case now with Christians ranging widely across theological spectrum. That variety is important to highlight, and one way, especially in early Christianity, that we can see that diversity is by visiting a website called Early Christian Writings. Just Google it and you'll get there, and you'll see the amazing collection of documents that are available showing the incredible diversity of early Christianity. We tend to narrow things down onto those who were the victors in the various debates that occurred among Christians, but the fact of the matter is there has always been a diversity of voices, as there were within Judaism and, of course, across Greco-Roman culture as well. So, along with that intolerance and hostility to certain enemies within Christianity, there has undoubtedly been an extraordinary degree of human creativity and incredible gifts to the history of culture in literature, music, architecture, art, goodness, truth, and beauty on the part of Christians. And we'll be studying those along with studying critically the behavior of some of our ancestors in the faith. MacCulloch's quite clear that while he is not a practicing Christian himself, he is a critical friend, I think he puts it, something like that, of Christianity and of Christians. But he does clearly have a moral focus to his writing. In other words, he wants to, as he puts it on page 12, promote sanity and curb rhetoric that leads to fanaticism. So be aware that throughout his book, and it's a big book, and we'll also be using it in the history of modern Christianity, so part 2, you'll get to read the whole book. There's that moral focus there. He is always, while being objective and looking at the evidence, also trying to promote sanity and to curb rhetoric that leads to fanaticism. So that's MacCulloch. Gives us some help in understanding our question for this week, as does Dennis Janz, the introduction to the collection of essays that he has in Volume 1 of A People's History of Christianity. Points out right from the outset that there have been, over the course of the millennia, roughly 10 billion Christians. Obviously very difficult to generalize about a movement with 10 billion in it. And one generalization, however, we can make quite clearly and honestly is that much of the history of Christianity, as it has been told over the last couple centuries of professional historical writing, is that history is focused on the elites, those who've left behind texts, those who were the victors in various debates and other kinds of conflict as well. What a people's history tries to do is flip the script and tell the story not of the few who were literate and who had access to means of communication, but tell the stories of the many. So if standard history of Christianity, church history, is institutional and hierarchical and tells the story of elites from above, people's history of Christianity seeks to tell the stories of everyday Christians, always in relationship to power, because that is how power operates, but in a way that is different and seeks, again, to tell about the lived experience of average people throughout the course of the history of Christianity. So power is one of the topics that comes up repeatedly in the essays that we'll be reading here, and I just want to take a brief digression and talk about what power means and how we understand power, because often power gets understood as power over, as domination or force. But Hannah Arendt, the great Jewish philosopher, argues that in fact power is different from force. Force is the capacity to manipulate material relations, whereas power, she suggests, is the capacity of people to act in concert. I think that's a beautiful way of understanding the constructive character of power. And power is not a dirty word. Many of you are seeking to prepare for ordination or for other forms of public leadership, then you'll be exercising power. It'll be difficult to get anything done without it. So, power, the capacity of people to act in concert. Martin Luther King Jr. Amended that a little bit in his own writings, where he talks about power as the capacity to realize or achieve purpose. Put these two together then, and what we have is an understanding of power as power with, rather than domination or power over. And the question then is, what kinds of power did Jesus generate? And how about the first Christians? What sorts of power were they able to enact? And what kinds of power did they seek as well? One of the themes that runs throughout the essays in Janz is that the first Christians, by and large, were often in a stance of resistance to empire and critique of the kind of domination and violence that was widespread in the Roman Empire. This critique of empire embraced economic critique, especially of the grotesque inequality that characterized the Roman Empire, a critique of sexuality, both the efforts to dominate or control it on the one hand, but also sexual license, which was widespread in the Roman Empire, especially for patrician males. And then finally, a political critique as well, resistance to the violence and oppression that was characteristic of empire then and now, and instead an emphasis on mutuality and cooperation that, again, is a different kind of power. So Janz is pretty clear that embracing a people's history is in many ways subversive, and I think you'll see that in the chapters that we take up. Starting with Richard Horsley's essay on the first Jesus movements on page 11. He clarifies quite directly, and I think it pays to read the thesis of the chapter. Page 11, this is the context in which Jesus arose. Large numbers of Galilean, Samaritan, and Judean peasants eagerly responded to the pronouncements of peasant prophets that God was again about to liberate them from their oppressive rulers and restore cooperative community life under the traditional divine principles of justice. So Jesus, as Horsley describes him, and I realize this may be a very different way of understanding Jesus than you have encountered before. Jesus was a village-based, Galilean, covenant renewal leader, who drew upon the prophetic tradition in Judaism and maybe to a degree messianic claims. And it's very clear that those messianic claims became stronger and stronger the further Christians became from Jesus' own life. So, drawing out that argument, Horsley describes other popular resistance and renewal movements under Roman rule. I think this is fascinating, that there were 4 peasant revolts in what is now Israel between 160 BCE, the Maccabean Revolt, and 135 CE, the Bar Kokhba Rebellion. The one that is probably best known is the one that took place between 66 and 70 when the Second Temple was destroyed. If you ever had an opportunity to go to Rome, go to the Forum, and you can see there the Arch of Titus, the son of Vespasian, the emperor, who led the army, the legionnaires who ruined Jerusalem and brought back to Rome all of the gold and many of the people, the leaders of the Jewish community in Jerusalem. If you want to read more about this, check out Josephus, a Roman historian who wrote The Jewish War, who describes these different rebellions, and all of which were ruthlessly put down by Rome through grotesque demonstrations of violence, of which crucifixion was one. Jesus was not the only one crucified. Thousands and thousands of both Roman citizens and Jewish citizens were crucified. 4 BCE, for one example, a peasant leader by the name of Judas led villagers to attack elite fortresses and villas and imperial storehouses. 66 to 70, Simon Bar Giora was proclaimed king, executed. And then 45 CE, an individual, another peasant rebellion leader by the name of Theudas, also brutally killed, is actually mentioned in Acts 5:36. So there was definitely awareness among the early Christians about these movements, and Jesus sort of fits in with them, takes a place within context, along with these other leaders. So these peasant movements, Horsley is quite clear, are not weekend warriors. These are people whose backs are against the wall. They're living with crushing debt. Many are unemployed, and the means they use to resist this oppression by the Roman occupiers is, withholding taxes, refusing to plant, in other words, going on strike, occasional episodic riots, and then the organization of these, in effect, militia movements that are led by prophets, or in some cases, in rarer cases, by messianic figures. So the first Jesus movements, then, Horsley contends, need to be understood in this context. Much of traditional Christian theology has isolated Jesus from his historical context, Horsley claims on page 21, and I think he's right. The sources that Horsley uses to understand these earliest Jesus movements before the tradition sort of set the boundaries of the tradition in place theologically, politically, economically, and socially are the saying sources, the Q source, and I have a hyperlink to it on our Canvas page, and the Gospel of Mark, which is the earliest of the 4 canonical Gospels. And what emerges from these 2 sources in particular is Jesus as this charismatic prophet figure, maybe Messiah in Mark, nothing about that in Q. And remember that of the Gospels, Mark is the one that really downplays the resurrection. It's maybe kind of sort of there. And this, to Horsley, points to a sign of who Jesus was early. Now, there's a long history of trying to understand the historical Jesus. Albert Schweitzer, the great Lutheran theologian, musician, historian, wrote the Quest for the Historical Jesus, arguing basically that every generation produces the Jesus that they want. That's true to a degree, but we now have a lot more resources to understand Jesus' context, and to read critically the texts that we do have about him in their wide diversity as well. And so what emerges then from this information is a picture of Jesus as a leader of this village-based Galilean covenant renewal movement. Three basic features of this covenant renewal movement. The first is that Jesus sends workers, missionaries, from the Galilean base out to neighboring villages and communities. These are, in effect, community organizers. And if you want to read the manual for these community organizers as it emerged in the 2nd century in particular, there's a text called the Didache, which really is a manual for apostles, for missionaries, and for the early Christian community. Check it out. I, again, have a hyperlink to it on our Canvas page. So first feature is sending out these missionaries to carry this covenant renewal movement. Second, there's an agenda associated with it, an ideology, and it is covenant renewal. The thrust, page 33 of this, is to restore the mutuality and solidarity of village communities. So that's what Jesus wanted to renew, is that community of mutuality and solidarity that the Roman occupation had threatened and in many ways degraded through economic inequality and through violence. One of the key features of the covenant in Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, are blessings and curses. One of the key features is blessings and curses. And of course, this is one of the key features of Jesus' teaching, too. Each of the parables has an element of blessing and curse in it, and then there are direct and overt blessings and curses that Jesus puts together, many of which you will be very familiar with. So, again, covenant renewal is the idea here. And then the third feature of this covenant renewal movement is the recognition of persecution as a reality. In other words, Jesus was aware of what had happened to these earlier figures, the many who had been put down by Roman force and violence. So what emerges from this picture of the early Jesus movements is something very different from what emerges in the urban communities that Paul founded. So this takes us back to the very roots, to the origins of this movement that then was mutated in fascinating and interesting ways by Paul, and then that got set in place through the 4 canonical Gospels. And again, this is why we read the non-canonical texts in order to understand the diversity within early Christianity. And one obvious source to recognize, the significance and importance of these features of Jesus' context in his teaching, just take a look at the Lord's Prayer. Of course, there's a theological element to it, an important one, but there's also this petition for, give us this day our daily bread. That's a peasant's petition. And release us from debt. These are the kind of realities that when we look at Jesus' context objectively, that we see as movement inspiration in the first century. It's important to recognize, finally, from Horsley, that Jesus did not intend to found a new religion. He was a Jew, a faithful Jew, and his first followers were Jewish as well. And again, this is one of the things that Paul very clearly changed. So what we're trying to do here is understand as much as we can the historical Jesus, while recognizing that invariably we also bring our own interests to that reconstruction process. Finally, then, the chapter by Herzog about why peasants were drawn to Jesus. It really builds on Horsley's chapter, narrows it in, uses a different set of sources. So whereas Horsley, it was Q and the Gospel of Mark and the Didache, for Herzog, it's Jesus' parables, which he interprets on page 65 as a prophetic pedagogy of the oppressed. First part of the article focuses on Judean and Galilean society, a great divide, that divide between rulers and ruled, rich and poor, city and country. These dualisms, set up tension and conflict and are very much part of Jesus' teaching and the experience of the first Christians. Herzog has a nice way of describing what he calls different traditions and transcripts. There's the public transcript of Jesus' life in the earliest Christians. There's the hidden transcript, often buried under allegory. We see this especially in the Gospel of John and in the book of Revelation, but it's all over all of the Gospels. This hidden transcript, in other words, these subversive elements, these critiques of empire in particular, that are there, but you have to be able to read beneath the surface in order to understand them. And that's why we read Scripture the way we do here at ULS. And the third feature that Herzog lifts up is the politics of disguise and anonymity. In other words, Christians had to be careful in their critiques because of the overt oppression brought to bear by the Roman Empire. Second section of the essay works from a perspective of Paulo Freire, a great Brazilian theologian and sociologist who in the 1970s wrote The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Great book. I think every pastor should read it, in fact. He contrasts, Freire does, what he calls banking education versus the pedagogy of the oppressed. Banking education, as it suggests, means you invest some ideas, thoughts, disciplines in students, and you hope that it produces an outcome. This presumes that the student doesn't already bring skills and background and insight to the process, and it reinforces conventional logics because you're investing from a perspective of the elites. What a pedagogy of the oppressed does instead is develops through processes of dialogue, which is what we try to do at ULS and what I try to do in the class through our online discussion forums. Develop a critical consciousness and awareness of the structures of oppression as they operate, and then a commitment to undo the oppression insofar as possible and to restore, reveal, to create a more just and peaceful society. This process is called praxis, and it involves a movement back and forth between reflection and action. That's page 77 in Herzog. Again, you should really go to the source, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I think it would be a very helpful way to understand what you're likely to experience in seminary, at least at some level. And then it would also give you a good model for Christian education if you're heading towards parish ministry. Finally, then, this chapter focuses on Jesus as a teacher of Galilean peasants in crisis. So this great divide between rich and poor, city and country, rulers and ruled, Jesus sees and depicts as a violation of the Torah and the covenant. And the sources that Herzog marshals to support this interpretation of Jesus in the earliest Christians would be the parables. First one, the rich man and Lazarus. A brilliant sentence on page 81. Iniquity produced inequity. All right, so again, this economic inequality, very much part of the text, and of course Jesus in the parable flips it with Lazarus seated beside Abraham, not the rich, as would conventionally be the case. Secondly, the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. The landowners playing God. Yahweh is the one who gave the land to the people of Israel, and Jesus in his parables exposes how the landowner mystified greed as generosity. All right, it's an interesting read on the parable. Take a look at it again. This is pages 86 and 87 in the text. And then finally, whose vineyard is it anyway? The parable of the wicked tenants. Here, Herzog argues, Yahweh is the landowner, which was, the point of the covenant in many ways, is that this gift of the land came from God to the people, but brought with it conditions as well. And it's those conditions that are being violated by the Romans and by the Jewish authorities through this escalating violence. And the parable very clearly depicts this. And so the picture that emerges then is of Jesus exposing corrupt rulers through these parables and reversing the structures of oppression that were the dynamic through which empire operated. Empire is always divided in order to conquer. That was Caesar who first said that. And that was very clearly the case, and something that Jesus and the earliest Christians fought against as well. So, conclusion of Herzog's essay, page 92, the Jesus movement was a people's movement whose strength not only grew from its leader, but developed a people's pedagogy that empowered the exploited and oppressed to claim their own history and their role in creating it. For the peasants of Galilee, it must have seemed as if the reign of heaven was at hand. So, was Jesus trying to make Galilean villages great again? Maybe. I'll look forward to your responses to that question. But very clearly, there's a lot that we can draw from the earliest Jesus movements and from Jesus' own life and teachings to help understand what is happening in our time too. This is how history works. It is understanding the past as clearly as possible in order to comprehend our present and be able to contribute to the future in a way that leads to greater flourishing of life for all. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this. It's gone a little longer than I usually like them to be, but there was a lot to say, and it's the first time we've been able to communicate with each other in this way. So thank you for your patience. And I hope you enjoy the readings as much as I did. Take care.